I was just a regular guy living in a small town in Indiana, working a 9 to 5 job at a local bank. Nothing in my life ever felt out of the ordinary until that night. That was when I came face to face with something that I can't explain, something that still haunts me to this very day. It started on a rainy Thursday evening in the fall. I was heading home from work, tired after a long day of paperwork and meetings. The weather had been gloomy all day, and now the streets were wet with the steady rainfall that never seemed to stop. I turned onto my street, which, as usual, was eerily quiet. The wind was picking up, and the trees swayed gently under the pressure of the gusts. My house was at the end of a dead-end street, an old 2-story building that I inherited from my grandparents. It wasn't much, but it was home. As I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, I noticed something odd, something I hadn't seen before. There, standing by my front porch, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the fading light, but the person appeared to be standing still, staring directly at my house. I figured it was just someone taking shelter from the rain, but there was something unsettling about the way they stood, completely motionless, as though they were waiting for something or someone. I got out of the car and walked up to the porch, hoping to get a better look. But when I reached the door, the figure was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. My heart started to race, but I chalked it up to the storm and the isolation of the area. I was just tired, and maybe I had imagined it. That night, I tried to shake the feeling that something was off. I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest before work the next day, but sleep didn't come easy. I tossed and turned for hours, the eerie feeling of being watched never quite leaving me. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud thud. It came from downstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I listened closely, trying to make out any other sounds, but the house was silent. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to go down there, but I couldn't just ignore the noise. I slowly descended, each step creaking under my weight. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the living room, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty. The air felt colder than usual, as though the house had dropped in temperature. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner into the living room. Everything appeared normal, except for the front door. It was wide open, the rain pouring in, creating puddles on the wooden floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved cautiously toward the door. It had been locked when I got home, so how was it open now? I stepped closer and noticed something else that made my stomach drop. There were muddy footprints leading from the door to the middle of the room. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was empty, and the storm was still raging outside. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I slept with the lights on that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing the sound of footsteps in the distance, echoing through the house. The next day, I couldn't concentrate at work. My mind kept drifting back to the strange events from the night before. Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Or had someone really broken into my house? I decided to check the security footage from the cameras I had installed around the house. I thought maybe it would help me make sense of it all. What I saw on the footage chilled me to the bone. The footage from the night before showed nothing unusual until the moment I went to bed. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., I saw the figure again, the same person I had seen on my porch the evening before. They were standing by my front door, watching the house just as I had witnessed. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them another figure appeared, tall and thin with dark, hollow eyes. The two of them stood there for several minutes, staring into the house before slowly walking off the camera's view. I froze, my mind racing. What was going on? Who were these people? Why were they watching me? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. Maybe they knew something about me. Maybe they were coming for me. But why? What had I done to deserve this? Over the next few days, I began to notice other strange occurrences. Objects around the house started to move. Things I hadn't touched were found in different places. My keys, my phone, even a few books on the shelf. Every time I turned around, it felt like something had shifted, as if I wasn't alone. One night, I decided to confront whatever was going on. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I waited until midnight and sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, waiting for whatever or whoever had been haunting me. My nerves were on edge, but I needed answers. As the clock struck 12:30, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, like someone was moving through the house. I stood up and grabbed a flashlight, trying to steady my trembling hands. I checked the windows. Nothing. No one outside. The footsteps continued, drawing closer and closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel the temperature drop in the room. It was as though the air itself had become thick with tension. And then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered and went out. I felt my heart race, my breath quicken. I was in complete darkness now. The only sound, the rain pounding against the windows. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the living room. I raised the flashlight and pointed it toward the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was coming toward me. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, that stood at the edge of the hallway. It was staring at me, its eyes hollow and dark, like there was nothing but emptiness behind them. The figure didn't move at first, but it didn't need to. I could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before it came any closer. But before I could make a move, the figure stepped forward. I bolted toward the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care if I looked like a coward. I had to get out. I yanked open the door and ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. I've never been back to that house since. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted, but I know it's still out there, watching. Maybe it's waiting for me to return, or maybe it's moved on to someone else. Either way, I don't care. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I still get the chills when I'm walking down the street at night. And every time I pass by my old house, I swear I can see someone standing in the window, staring back at me.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. Not at first, anyway. I thought it was all just people's overactive imaginations or their need to explain the unexplainable. That was until I moved into that old house on Willow Lane. It was one of those massive, creaky Victorian homes, the kind with long hallways, creaking floorboards, and windows that never seemed to let the sunlight in completely. But I'd just gotten a new job in a nearby town, and the rent was cheap, so I didn't think twice about it. The first week, everything seemed fine. I unpacked, settled in, and even hosted a few friends over. The house felt a little off, maybe, but nothing alarming. It wasn't until the second week that things started to change. It started with the whispers. I'd be sitting in my living room, reading or watching TV, and suddenly I'd hear soft voices coming from the hallway. I thought it was just the house settling, but it happened too often to ignore. It was always quiet, barely audible, but unmistakable. A conversation happening just out of earshot. I tried to brush it off, assuming maybe my neighbors were talking, or maybe I was just hearing things. But the whispers weren't the worst part. It was the tapping. At first, I thought it was a tree branch scraping against the window at night. But I quickly realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. At night, when everything else was quiet, the tapping would begin. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. Tap, tap. I'd try to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but it would always grow louder, as if whatever was tapping wanted my attention. I remember one night, about 3 weeks into living there. I was in bed, just drifting off to sleep when the tapping started. This time, though, it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the ceiling, directly above my bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I got up and grabbed a flashlight, convinced it was some sort of animal or something that had gotten into the attic. I opened the door to the attic, which creaked eerily as I pulled it back. The stairs leading up were steep and narrow, the air musty and cold. The flashlight beam flickered as I climbed the steps, the tapping growing louder with each step I took. When I reached the top, I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the dusty space. There was nothing there. I stood in the middle of the attic, the tapping now almost deafening, but I couldn't see a thing. I was about to turn and leave when the flashlight caught something in the corner. There, huddled in the shadows, was a small wooden rocking chair. It was rocking back and forth slowly, creaking with every movement. The sound of tapping came from the chair. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that chair rocking in the darkness, tapping, tapping, tapping. The next morning, I went to the local library to try to learn more about the house. I found a history book on the town, and after some digging, I discovered something that made my stomach churn. The house had been built over a century ago, and there were stories of strange occurrences going back as far as anyone could remember. A woman named Clara had once lived there, and it was said that she had lost her child in a tragic accident. Afterward, she'd become obsessed. They say she'd sit in that very attic, rocking in that chair for hours on end, waiting for her child to come back. But the worst part of the story came next. It wasn't just the chair that disturbed me. The whispers I had heard, they were the voices of children, Clara's children. The next few days, the activity escalated. I'd wake up to find things moved around. My keys on the kitchen table, my shoes by the front door, and one morning, I found the rocking chair at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just a chair anymore. It was a symbol of the ghost that lingered in the house, trapped in grief and madness. One night, as I sat in the living room, trying to focus on work, I heard something I hadn't heard before. It wasn't a whisper. It was a voice, clear, demanding. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. It came from the hallway again. But this time, it wasn't just the voices of children. It was something else. The voice wasn't a child's at all. It was deep, raspy, like it had been waiting for years to speak. I got up and walked toward the hallway, my legs shaking beneath me. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped forward. I reached the end of the hallway and stood there, the silence thickening around me. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, almost a growl. "Help me." I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I tried to lock it, but the door wouldn't budge. I could hear it now, outside my room, scratching at the door, tapping again, but this time it was different. It was as though something was trying to get in, trying to reach me. And then there was a knock. Not a tap, not a scratch. A knock, as though someone was standing right outside my door. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting to the windows, to the closet. I was alone. But I didn't feel alone. I felt watched. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the landlord the next day, demanding to know what was going on with the house. His response was chilling. "I'm afraid there's not much I can tell you," he said. "The house has been in my family for generations. That some things are better left undisturbed. Just leave it be. Don't go looking for things you don't want to find." I didn't listen. I couldn't. That night, I took matters into my own hands. I gathered what little courage I had and went into the attic again. The rocking chair was still there, rocking in the shadows, tapping on the floor. But this time, there was something new. A coldness in the air that cut through me like a knife. The whispers were louder now, echoing around me. I could hear Clara's voice clearly. "Help me." I approached the chair, my body trembling, and that's when I saw it. The figure standing in the corner. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring right at me. She was wearing a long, tattered dress. Her mouth opened, and I could hear the voice clearer than ever. "Help me." I screamed and ran out of the attic, down the stairs, through the house, and out the front door. I didn't look back. I stayed at a friend's house for the next few days, and when I finally returned, everything was different. The house was silent, too silent. The whispers had stopped. The tapping had stopped. The chair was gone, but I could still feel it. The presence. It wasn't gone. It was still there, watching, waiting. And every night, I hear the tapping again. I'm not sure if it's just my mind playing tricks on me or if Clara is still waiting, still trapped in the grief of her lost children. But I can't leave. Not now. I never believed in ghosts, not until I heard Clara's voice, not until I felt her reach out to me, demanding my help. I'm trapped here now, with her, waiting for the tapping to start again.
Next story.
I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. I don't know if it's the darkness of the memories that haunts me or the fear that never truly left, but I have to share it before it consumes me completely. It started on an ordinary evening. I had just moved into a new place, a house just outside of town, secluded on the edge of a thick, dark forest. A little too quiet, a little too isolated, but I was eager for some peace and privacy. The house was old, a two-story farmhouse with creaky floors, cracked windows, and a chimney that seemed to groan with every gust of wind. My friends had warned me, joking about it being haunted, but I laughed it off. Everyone says that about old houses, right? The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked my things, set up my new life, and got used to the stillness. But it was on the fourth night that things started to change. I was sitting in the living room, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. It was a cold, crisp evening, and the wind outside howled like a wild animal. The house seemed to groan in response. There was a certain heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. I felt watched. You know how sometimes when you're alone, you get that eerie feeling that someone is staring at you? It was like that. I turned my head to the shadows in the corner, but nothing was there. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The silence was deafening, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room. Suddenly, a loud bang came from upstairs. I froze, my heart racing. The house settled a lot, but this was different. It was as if something or someone had slammed a door. I stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears, and cautiously made my way to the stairs. Each step creaked louder than the last, and I could feel the darkness pressing in around me. The feeling of being watched was intensifying, like invisible eyes were following my every move. I reached the top of the stairs, the darkness so thick I could barely see my own hand in front of me. I hesitated, listening. Nothing. The house was still. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. Maybe a gust had forced something to fall. I took another step, and then another, creeping toward the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. The air was unnaturally cold up there, and the floorboards beneath my feet groaned with each step. When I reached the bedroom door, it was slightly ajar, the dim light from downstairs casting eerie shadows across the floor. I pushed the door open slowly, every instinct in me screaming to run, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward. That's when I saw it. The room was empty, nothing out of place. But the air was thick with an oppressive energy. As I stood there trying to figure out what had caused the noise, I felt it. Someone was standing behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. But the feeling didn't go away. The pressure in the room grew heavier, suffocating. It was as if the room itself was alive, and it was angry. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I pounded on it, desperation rising in my chest, but it was no use. I turned back to the room, my eyes searching the shadows for some explanation. That's when I saw it again. In the corner of the room, just past the wardrobe, I saw a figure. It was a faint outline at first, just a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, but then it became clearer. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by darkness, stood just beyond the reach of the light. His clothes were old-fashioned, faded, and torn, but it wasn't just his appearance that terrified me. It was his eyes, or the lack of them. His face was smooth, featureless, like something had scraped the humanity right off of him. My heart raced. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. I could feel the cold emanating from him, chilling me to the bone. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with fear. And then, in a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It was hollow, echoing, like it came from deep within the earth itself. I felt it vibrate in my bones, like a sound that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. My hands trembled as I reached for the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The man, or whatever it was getting closer, and I could feel the darkness swallowing the room. I had to get out. I didn't know how, but I had to. I turned and ran for the window, but as I reached it, the glass shattered before me. I fell back, hitting the floor hard, but before I could move, I heard the voice again, closer this time. "You're not leaving." The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The figure was standing over me now, its cold presence suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My whole body was frozen, paralyzed by terror. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the figure leaning in close to my ear. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its breath, cold as death, brushing against my skin. Everyone who stays here stays forever. When I woke up, I was back downstairs. I was lying on the couch drenched in sweat, my heart still pounding in my chest. The fire had gone out and the house was silent again. I thought it was a nightmare. Maybe I had just imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I went upstairs, I found the door to the master bedroom was wide open. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong, like it was still holding on to something. The figure was still there. It had been there all along, waiting. Days passed, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The house felt alive, and not in a good way. I heard footsteps behind me when no one was there, whispers in the dark that would make my skin crawl. Every time I turned around, the figure would be there, just out of sight, always watching. I tried to leave, but something kept me there. The house, the darkness. It was like it had claimed me. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I couldn't escape. It was always there, lurking in the shadows. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe I just want someone to know. I'm not sure if I'm still here or if I've already become part of the house. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see his face staring back at me. The man with no eyes. He's still waiting.
Next story.
I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who doesn't believe in anything that can't be explained by logic. I was raised that way, by parents who valued science and reason above all else. And for the most part, I lived my life with that mindset, until I spent one summer in a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a break from the noise of everyday life. I had rented a small, secluded cabin for a few weeks, hoping to find some quiet and solitude. The cabin was remote, so far out that it wasn't on any map, and the road leading to it was barely more than a dirt path through the forest. But I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I looked forward to it. I was eager to clear my head and do some writing, far from the distractions of the city. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, the sound of birds and rustling leaves filling the air. The cabin was small but charming, with a wooden porch and a large stone fireplace inside. It looked old but well maintained, and it had everything I needed for a peaceful stay. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, had given me the keys and brief instructions. She didn't stick around for long, and I was left to my own devices. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner, and sat out on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. It felt peaceful, like a perfect escape from the stresses of the real world. I went to bed early, looking forward to the next day of solitude. But the next night, things changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping on the window. I sat up, disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind, there was no breeze, and the tap was deliberate, almost like someone was knocking. I crept out of bed and padded across the room, slowly pulling back the curtains. There was nothing there, just the dark expanse of trees swaying in the night. I shook my head, convinced that I had imagined it, but as I turned back to the bed, the tapping came again, this time louder and more insistent. I froze, my body stiff with fear. There was no one out there. I was completely alone. The tapping continued like a slow, rhythmic knock on the window. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A bird? But no animal taps like that. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, and it was coming from the same spot each time. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and cautiously opened the window. I shined the beam out into the night, my hands shaking. Nothing, just the dark woods, silent and still. But as I pulled my head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Movement, just outside the window. I snapped the flashlight back toward the spot, but there was nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking, but no one was there. I slammed the window shut, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind had caused something to tap against the glass. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The woods seemed darker, the trees looming closer than before. I ventured into town to get supplies, but the place felt wrong. It was small, isolated, and the people there didn't seem particularly friendly. They kept their eyes on me, whispering among themselves when I walked past. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my nerves from the night before. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, but the tapping came again, louder than before. It echoed through the cabin like a knock on a coffin, chilling me to the bone. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. It continued over and over again until it sounded as though someone was walking along the walls outside, dragging something heavy. I finally couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed the rifle from the corner of the room. Mrs. Hargrove had left it behind for safety, and stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the darkness. I pointed the flashlight at the tree line, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. There was nothing. The forest was still, eerily silent. I stood there for a long time, but nothing moved. There was no sound, no tapping. It was as if the night had swallowed whatever had been causing the noise. But when I turned to go back inside, I saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the yard, just outside the beam of the flashlight. It was tall, thin, and wearing a long coat that fluttered in the wind. I could barely make out its features, but there was something unmistakably wrong about it. It didn't belong there. I froze, too terrified to move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, motionless, staring at me with eyes I couldn't see but felt burning into me. Without thinking, I raised the rifle, aiming it in the direction of the figure, but before I could pull the trigger, it disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I spent the rest of the night in a panic, barricading myself inside and listening to the eerie silence outside. The tapping never came again, but I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to hold something watching me. Every creak of the wood felt like footsteps. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The next day, I decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that place. But as I packed my things, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. The mirror was in the hallway, and when I looked into it, I saw the same figure that had been outside, standing right behind me, grinning with a twisted, cruel smile. Its eyes were hollow, like there was nothing inside, just an endless void. I screamed, stumbling back, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty. The figure was gone. I looked back at the mirror. It was just a normal reflection, nothing out of place. But I could still feel its presence lingering in the air. I left the cabin that day, never looking back. As I drove away, I saw something in my rearview mirror, just for a split second, a shadow moving along the edge of the woods, and then it was gone. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I'll never forget it. The memories of the tapping, the figure, and the mirror haunt me to this day. I don't know if it was a ghost or something else entirely. All I know is that some places, some things, are better left unexplored.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, not even for a second. I grew up in a small town where everyone had their stories, haunted houses, eerie noises, strange occurrences, but I always chalked it up to imagination. That was until I stayed at my friend's old farmhouse, a place I never thought would change my mind. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a couple of us staying at his family's place in the country. It was a huge, sprawling farmhouse with a big barn out back and acres of overgrown fields. My friend Jake had warned me about the house a few times, but always with a laugh, saying how his family had lived there for generations and it was just an old place. He said it was perfectly fine and they'd never had any real problems. But the minute we arrived, I felt it. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. The house seemed alive in a way that I couldn't explain. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the place smelled like dust and old wood. The stairs creaked as we walked up to the second floor, and the floors underfoot were uneven, almost like the house was settling in a way that felt too deliberate. Jake's family was out for the weekend, leaving just us. He showed me to the guest room, a small, dimly lit space with vintage furniture. There was an old-fashioned mirror hanging on the wall above the bed, its edges tarnished and fogged with age. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another quirky part of the house. The first night passed uneventfully, aside from the usual country sounds, the wind blowing through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. But the second night was different. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps like someone was walking down the hall. At first, I thought it was Jake coming to check on me or just getting a drink, but the footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited, hoping it was just my imagination, but when the sound didn't fade, I sat up in bed. My room was dark and my phone was the only light I had, so I checked the time. It was 3:13 a.m. I remember it exactly, like the time itself was important. I got out of bed cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't loud, but they were persistent, coming closer and closer. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, the door creaked on its own. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the door swung open just a few inches. No one was there. I stood frozen for a moment, not sure if I should step into the hall. The air felt different, colder. The silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to stretch out in all directions. My breath came in shallow gasps as I slowly stepped into the hallway. There was no one there. But the footsteps, they started again, this time coming from the end of the hall. I could hear them clearly now, slow, dragging steps like something was being pulled across the floor. I turned and rushed back into my room, slamming the door behind me. I locked it. I don't know why. I just felt like I had to. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I sat against the wall, my phone clutched in my hand, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. I could hear faint whispers too, soft and distant, like they were coming from inside the walls. But every time I tried to listen closely, the whispers stopped. My mind was racing. Was I hearing things? Was I just being paranoid? The next morning, Jake found me sitting on the edge of the bed, bleary-eyed and exhausted. When I told him what happened, he just laughed. "Oh man, you heard it too, didn't you?" he said. "I told you the house was weird." "What are you talking about? You knew about this?" "Yeah, kind of," Jake said with an uneasy chuckle. "The thing is, my family's always known there's something here. It's been around for years. My grandfather used to tell me stories about it, but I never really believed it either. Until I started staying here alone. He said there's a presence, something that moves through the house at night. He told me to never stay in the guest room, but I didn't think it was a big deal." I stared at him, feeling the weight of what he was saying sink in. "You're telling me that this house is haunted?" Jake shrugged. "I guess so. It doesn't bother me anymore, but I figured I should warn you." I didn't want to admit it, but I was shaken. I spent the rest of the weekend trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, but the house kept pressing in on me. The whispers came back every night, and the footsteps became more frequent, as though something was circling the house, moving between rooms. I could never pinpoint where they came from, just the sound of slow, dragging steps, always just out of reach. It wasn't until the last night, as we were packing up to leave, that I truly understood what was happening. Jake's parents had come back early, and I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their conversation was too strange to ignore. "You let them stay upstairs again?" Jake's mother asked. "You know what happened last time?" Jake's father sighed. "I thought it was just a phase, but I'm starting to think the house is waking up again. It's been quiet for so long, but now it's stirring." Jake's mom sounded worried. "I don't want anyone else to get hurt. We shouldn't have stayed here as long as we did. What if it gets worse?" My heart sank as I realized what they were talking about. This wasn't just some quirky house. This was a place where something dark lived, something old and angry that had been here long before they ever moved in. The footsteps came back that night, louder than ever. But this time there was something different. A heavy presence seemed to fill the air, thick with malice. I could feel it in my bones, this cold, suffocating weight. I couldn't get away fast enough. Jake and I left the next morning. We didn't say much, but I could see the look in his eyes. He had known it was there, just like his family had. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something worse, a presence that claimed the house as its own, feeding on fear, growing stronger over time. As I left, I glanced back at the old farmhouse. The windows were dark, but something moved behind them, just out of sight. I don't think I'll ever go back. I don't know what that thing was, but I don't want to find out. Some places are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
It started on a rainy night. I was driving back home from a friend's house. the roads slick with rain and the headlights from passing cars blurring in the storm. I took the back roads to avoid the traffic on the highway. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark, silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. There were no streetlights out here, just the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the narrow, winding path. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, soaked to the bone, holding a sign that read, "Help." It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers at night, but something about this one felt different. The way she stood there, so still, staring into the rain, made my stomach twist. Something wasn't right. I slowed down as I approached, ready to keep driving. But as I got closer, she turned to face me. Her hair was soaked, sticking to her face, and her clothes hung off her thin frame like they'd been through hell. But it was her eyes that made me stop. They were wide, almost hollow, like she hadn't slept in days. She seemed frantic, desperate. Before I could think twice, I rolled down my window. "You need help?" I asked, my voice unsure. She didn't answer at first, just stood there, shivering. Then her voice cracked when she spoke. "Please," she whispered. "Can you give me a ride?" I didn't want to. Something deep told me not to let her in, but I couldn't just leave her standing there in the pouring rain. I was raised better than that. "All right, hop in," I said. She climbed into the passenger seat without saying another word. She was soaking wet, her clothes clinging to her skin. I could feel the chill radiating from her, and the smell of mildew filled the car. I turned on the heat to try to warm her up, but she didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if she was in a trance. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rain tapping against the windows and the tires splashing through puddles. I kept glancing at her, trying to gauge her reaction, but she never looked at me. She just stared out the window, her eyes glazed over, like she wasn't really there. After a few miles, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "So what's your name?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring out the window, but after a long moment she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Lucy. Lucy," I repeated. "Where are you headed?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I just need to get away." Her response was so strange, so hollow that I felt an uneasy shiver run down my spine. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind raced. I wondered why she hadn't said where she was from or where she was going. I wondered why she didn't ask me to stop or tell me what happened. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't place it. We drove on, the rain showing no sign of stopping. The farther we went, the more I began to feel like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. Then I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road ahead, another person. This time, a man. I could barely make him out through the rain, but I could see that he was staring directly at my car, his posture rigid and unnatural. "Do you want to stop?" I asked Lucy, glancing at her. I could feel a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach, but I didn't want to appear paranoid. But Lucy's eyes, those hollow eyes, snapped to mine. "No," she said sharply, her voice suddenly tense. "Don't stop. Keep driving." I didn't question it. I pressed the gas, my pulse quickening. As I drove past the figure, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I saw the man's face, a twisted, grimacing expression, his eyes wide and unblinking. But then, just as quickly as I saw it, it was gone. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I glanced over at Lucy. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was trembling now, her eyes wide with fear, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head to face the window again, her face pressing against the glass like she was trying to escape the car. I was just about to ask her again when I saw another figure ahead, a woman standing by the side of the road. I slowed down, ready to stop, but Lucy let out a desperate, choking sound. "Don't!" she gasped. "Please don't stop." I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past the woman. I looked in the rearview mirror again. The woman was still standing there, but as I watched, her form seemed to flicker like a glitch in reality. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered, my heart racing. Lucy's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "They're not real." I turned to her, my eyes wide. "What do you mean?" They're the ones who did this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't let me go. They won't let me leave." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean? Leave? What are you talking about? Lucy's head snapped toward me, her eyes wild with fear. I died. I died a long time ago, she whispered, almost pleading. They're taking me back. I can't escape. I felt my stomach drop. I knew I had to stop the car, but I couldn't. I was frozen in fear, the road stretching out before me like a dark tunnel. And then it happened. The car seemed to lurch forward as if something had grabbed it and yanked it. The air grew thick, suffocating. My headlights flickered, and for a split second, I saw the figures again. Dozens of them, standing on the side of the road, watching, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded, the tires losing grip on the slick road. I heard a scream, a blood-curdling scream, just as the car spun out of control, the world around me blurring into a vortex of darkness. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the same spot I had picked Lucy up from. My car was still running, the rain still pouring down, but Lucy was gone. I sat there in stunned silence, my hands shaking. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No hitchhiker, no man, no woman. The road was empty. I never saw Lucy again, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to stop. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I see the figures standing on the side of the road again. Always watching, always waiting. But now, I never stop.
Next story.
I'm not one to believe in ghosts or spirits, but what happened to me that night changed everything. It's the kind of experience that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the world. And now, even though it's been months, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. It started last fall when I moved into a new apartment. It was a small, cozy place on the second floor of an old building in downtown Chicago. The rent was affordable, and the landlord seemed like a nice enough guy, a little eccentric, but nothing out of the ordinary. He told me that the building had been around for over 100 years, but it was well maintained. At least that's what I thought at the time. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, got used to the creaky floors, and familiarized myself with the neighborhood. But then, on one particularly cold evening, things started to feel off. I had just gotten back from work, and the first thing I noticed was the light in the hallway outside my apartment. It was flickering. I thought it was a faulty bulb, but when I went to check it out, the light suddenly stopped flickering and stayed on, like it was waiting for me to walk past. I shook it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. But as the days went on, strange things began happening. Little things at first. My keys would go missing, only to show up in places I was certain I hadn't left them. The TV remote would be on the kitchen counter when I was sure I had left it on the couch. But then it escalated. One night I was sitting in my living room, watching TV, when I heard a knock on my front door. It was late, around 11 p.m., so I wasn't expecting anyone. I got up, looked through the peephole, and saw nothing. No one was there. I figured it was just some kids messing around, so I locked the door and went back to the couch. But a few minutes later, the knock came again, louder this time. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't normal for someone to knock at this hour, especially with no one in sight. I decided to call the landlord just to be safe. Maybe someone was trying to break in. He answered on the second ring, and when I explained what was happening, he was strangely calm. He told me that the building had a history of odd occurrences, strange noises, flickering lights, and unexplained knocks on doors. But he reassured me that it was nothing to worry about, just the quirks of an old building. He said I'd get used to it. I didn't feel reassured. I wasn't sure what to make of it all, but I didn't want to seem paranoid either. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And that night, when I finally went to bed, I left the light on in the hallway, just in case. But things didn't stop there. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. It was quiet at first, almost like someone was walking slowly across the floor. I lay there, wide awake, straining to hear. The footsteps came closer, and I felt a cold chill run through the room. Then they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I stayed frozen, not daring to move. My heart was racing, and every instinct told me to get up, to check, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to know who or what was on the other side of that door. The footsteps started again, but this time they moved away from my door and down the hallway. I waited for what felt like hours. my eyes fixed on the door, but eventually I fell back asleep, exhausted from fear. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone about it. I felt ridiculous. Maybe it was just my imagination, or the sound of the building settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That day, when I came home from work, things took a turn for the worse. The door to my apartment was wide open. I panicked, rushing inside, fearing the worst. But nothing seemed to be disturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign that anyone had been inside. The only thing that was different was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there, something musty, like old wood or damp earth. It made me feel sick to my stomach. I checked everything, my belongings, the windows, the locks, but nothing seemed amiss. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had just forgotten to lock the door. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The knocking started again that night. But this time, it wasn't just a knock on the door. It was a series of rapid, insistent bangs, louder, more forceful. My heart raced as I got up and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door and looked around, my pulse pounding in my ears. No one. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The knocks continued for days, always at night, always when I was alone. And then the dreams began. I started having vivid dreams of a woman, a tall, pale woman with long, dark hair. She would stand at the foot of my bed just watching me. I could feel her presence, her cold stare piercing into me, being like, but every time I tried to move or speak, I couldn't. It was like she was paralyzing me with fear. In one dream, I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman reached toward me, her bony fingers brushing my skin, and I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. One morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the landlord and asked if I could move out. I had to get away from this place, from whatever was happening. But when I spoke to him, he told me something that made my blood run cold. The woman, he said, she's been here for years. No one knows who she is, but she's always been part of the building. She never leaves. I didn't know how to react. I was speechless. What did he mean by that? Was this woman some kind of ghost, a spirit tied to the building? Was I being haunted? I left that afternoon, packed up my things, and moved into a hotel. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being followed. Every time I look over my shoulder, I feel like someone's there, just out of view. I've had the same dreams, the same nightmares, and even though I've moved on, I can't shake the image of that woman's face. Something about that building, something about that place is still with me, and I don't think I'll ever escape it.
Next story.
I'll never forget the night I moved into the old farmhouse on Elm Street. It was one of those houses you drive past and wonder, who would ever live there? A tall, two-story structure with faded red paint, creaky windows, and an overgrown yard. It looked abandoned, but there was a for rent sign out front, and I needed a place to stay. The rent was cheap, and I figured I could fix it up. The landlord didn't seem to care much about the place. He gave me the key without asking for much paperwork and just mentioned in passing that the house had been vacant for a long time. His exact words were, "It's a good spot for someone looking for peace and quiet." At first, it felt peaceful, quiet even. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual settling noises from an old house. But as the days went on, things started to feel off. I'd wake up at night, heart racing, as if I'd heard something just before drifting off to sleep. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the old house groaning, but after a week, it became clear that something else was going on. The first real sign of something strange happened one night when I was in the kitchen. I was making a late-night snack when I heard it, a soft, dragging sound coming from the upstairs hallway. It sounded like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Thinking it was just the house settling, I ignored it. But then I heard it again the next night and the night after that. The sound was always the same, rhythmic and slow, like a dragging chair or a heavy trunk. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly crept upstairs, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed that the hallway light was on, which was odd because I was sure I had turned it off before going to bed. The dragging sound grew louder, now coming from the farthest bedroom at the end of the hallway. My pulse quickened, and my breath hitched. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel something watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was empty, but the window was open. A cold breeze rushed in, the heft and the curtains fluttered. I couldn't explain why, but that was when I started to feel like something was terribly wrong. I closed the window, walked around the room, and checked the closet. Nothing. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange on the floor. An old, tattered rug in the corner of the room. It was slightly askew, as though something had been moved beneath it. My heart raced as I pulled it back. There, in the dusty floorboards, was a trapdoor. I'd never seen it before, but it was clearly old with rusted hinges. I stared at it for a long moment before I finally decided to open it. I hesitated. Part of me screamed not to open it, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed the edge of the trapdoor and pried it open. What I saw beneath was a small, narrow staircase leading into complete darkness. The air from below felt cold and damp, and a strange, musty smell wafted up. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to go down there. My heart thumped wildly as I took a step onto the first creaky step, then another. The deeper I went, the colder it became. My flashlight flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that twisted and contorted. I could hear my own breathing, the only sound in the suffocating silence. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with dust. My flashlight landed on something in the corner, a wooden chest. It wasn't much to look at, but something about it drew me in. I walked over, my hands shaking as I reached for the lid. My heart was pounding in my chest. As I opened it, I found a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age, and a few scattered objects. A doll, a broken watch, and what looked like a small journal. I picked up the journal first, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was erratic, frantic. It was dated from decades ago, but one entry stood out. I hear her voice again. In the dark, in the walls, it calls my name. She says she's coming. I don't know what to do anymore. The entry made my skin crawl. As I read it, a sudden noise broke through the silence, an unmistakable dragging sound. It was coming from above, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just the floorboards creaking. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I stood frozen, panic surging through me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I could feel something on the other side, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as the door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, cloaked in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it wore a long, tattered coat that hung loosely around its frame. Its face was hidden in darkness, but I could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, staring right at me. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I felt paralyzed, trapped in place. The figure stepped forward, its steps unnaturally slow, dragging something behind it. The thing it dragged was a large, blood-stained burlap sack. And then I saw it, the face of the thing in the shadows. The skin was pale and stretched tight, as though it hadn't been used in years. Its mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "She's here," it whispered in a raspy voice, "and she's not alone." I barely had time to react before the world went dark. I woke up back in my bed, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. It took me a few moments to realize I was home, that it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked around, and something was wrong. The room was the same, but the air felt different, heavy, oppressive. The photographs were no longer on the floor, but on the bed beside me, and the journal was open to the same page. "She's here." I heard the dragging sound again, but this time it was right outside my door. I knew then that I was no longer alone.
Next story.
I've always been the skeptical type. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and paranormal encounters were all just fiction to me, nothing more than tales to tell around a campfire. But that all changed one evening when I took a road trip to a small, remote town in North Carolina. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a weekend to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, clear my head, and enjoy some quiet time in the country. I rented a cabin on the outskirts of a town called Ashford Hollow, a place so small it wasn't even on most maps. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The cabin was charming, old but well kept, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. The owner, an elderly man named Roy, gave me the key and reminded me that the area could be a little unsettling at night. "You'll hear strange things out here," he said with a knowing look. I assumed it was just his way of trying to be spooky for fun, so I laughed it off. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some dinner, and spent the evening reading a book. As the night wore on, I could hear the usual sounds of the forest: the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant call of a coyote. Nothing unusual. I went to bed, slept soundly, and woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. The second day, however, things started to take a turn. I decided to go for a hike in the woods behind the cabin. The area was beautiful: tall trees, moss-covered rocks, and the quiet murmur of a stream nearby. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of being watched. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence was unnerving. There was no wind, no animals, nothing, just a suffocating stillness. I pushed the feeling aside and continued, thinking maybe it was just my overactive imagination. But then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, draped in what looked like a long, dark cloak. At first, I thought it was just another hiker or someone else out for a walk, but as I approached, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. My heart raced. I tried to call out, but no words came out. I felt paralyzed, as if my body was refusing to move. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. I stood there for several minutes, unsure of what I had just seen. The whole encounter felt wrong, like I wasn't meant to see it. Shaking, I made my way back to the cabin, but the unease stayed with me. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that it was probably just someone who had been out in the woods longer than I had. But something in my gut told me otherwise. That evening, I went out to the porch to sit and clear my head. The night was darker than usual, and the wind had started to pick up. It wasn't cold, but there was an eerie chill in the air. As I sat there, staring out into the forest, I heard a soft sound, a whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it seemed to be coming from just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded so familiar. I stood up and peered into the darkness, my heart pounding. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. I strained to hear it, and when it came again, I realized it wasn't a voice at all. It was a laugh. A low, dark laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. I ran inside and locked the door, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. The laughter seemed to echo in my head, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I decided to pack up and leave the next morning. I didn't want to stick around any longer. But when I tried to leave, I discovered something horrifying. The road that led out of the cabin was blocked. It wasn't by anything physical, no fallen trees or rocks. It was the trees themselves, or rather, something that had happened to them. The path that had been clear the day before was now tangled with brambles, branches twisted in unnatural angles, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fog that seemed to move on its own. I tried to walk through the fog, but it felt oppressive, like something was pushing me back. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth. I turned around and headed back to the cabin, but the forest around me looked different, darker, twisted, like something had changed while I wasn't looking. As I approached the cabin, I saw it again, the figure. This time it was standing right in front of the porch, its dark cloak billowing in the wind, its face obscured by the shadows. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do, but my body was frozen. The figure raised its hand and pointed at me, a long, bony finger that seemed to stretch impossibly far. It whispered something, its voice barely audible, but the words sent a chill through my bones. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, the fog thickened and the figure was gone. The woods fell silent once more. I didn't think, I just ran. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and forced my way through the tangled forest. I wasn't sure if I was still on the trail or if I had wandered into the heart of the woods, but all I could think about was getting away. Somehow, I found my way back to the road. The fog had lifted and the sun was starting to rise. I flagged down a car that was passing by and begged the driver for a ride out of there. When I told him about what had happened, he just looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I couldn't get out of that place fast enough. I haven't been back to Ashford Hollow since. I don't know what I encountered in those woods, but I know I'll never go near that place again. There are places in this world that you just shouldn't visit, things you're not meant to see. And I learned that the hard way.
Next story.
I've always loved hiking. There's something about being out in the wilderness far from the noise of the city that calms my mind. So when a friend invited me on a weekend hiking trip to the Appalachian Mountains, I didn't hesitate. We planned to spend 2 days in the woods, camping overnight at a remote spot only accessible by a difficult trail. It was exactly the kind of adventure I was looking for. The trail was beautiful at first, lush trees, bubbling streams, and the distant call of birds. We made our way along the rugged path, stopping to take in the sights and catch our breath. There was a group of us, 5 in total, and we were in good spirits, joking around and swapping stories. It felt like a perfect escape from the everyday grind. By late afternoon, we reached the point where we planned to camp. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air had a crisp chill to it. Our spot was tucked away in a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. We set up our tents, built a fire, and began preparing dinner. As the fire crackled and the sky turned dark, we sat around it, talking and laughing. But as the night wore on, something started to feel wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was an odd stillness in the air. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl were gone. The silence was so deep it was almost suffocating. I tried to shake it off. I mean, we were in the middle of nowhere, and nature is unpredictable, right? But the unease wouldn't go away. I glanced at the others and I could see that they were feeling it too. They weren't saying anything, but I could tell by their tense expressions and the way they kept looking over their shoulders that they sensed something. We kept the fire burning brightly, hoping it would ward off whatever unease had settled in. But the night stretched on, and the feeling only grew stronger. Around midnight, we all decided to turn in. We each crawled into our tents, zipped them up tight, and tried to get some sleep. I was just about to drift off when I heard something, a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the woods. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what kind of animal would make such a noise, but it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It didn't sound natural. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the growl to come again. After what felt like forever, the sound returned, closer this time. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? But then I realized, whatever it wasn't acting like any animal I knew. It was too deliberate, too intelligent. I didn't want to wake the others, but I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. Slowly, I unzipped the door and crawled out, trying to make as little noise as possible. The fire was still burning, but it was dim, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I strained my eyes, trying to see if I could spot whatever was making the sound. That's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, there was a figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly still. It was watching us. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and my body went cold. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but there was something wrong with that figure. It was too silent, too unnatural. I quickly ducked back into the tent, my heart racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a person lost in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that growl again, closer and closer, until it felt like it was right outside my tent. And every time I opened my eyes, I half expected to see that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. At first light, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I woke up the others, telling them we needed to pack up and leave immediately. They were groggy and confused, but when I mentioned the growling and the figure, their expressions changed. They'd heard it too. they admitted, though none of them had seen the thing I'd glimpsed in the night. We didn't waste any time. We gathered our gear and made our way back down the trail, sticking close together, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in around us as we made our way down the narrow path. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. But the worst part was when we finally reached the trailhead, where the parking lot was supposed to be. We had been on the trail for hours, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the car we had parked there. We searched the entire lot and then the nearby area, but the car was gone. It was as if it had disappeared into thin air. We were in a panic by then, not knowing what to do. It didn't make any sense. We had parked the car there, right by the entrance, and now it was gone. We walked back into the woods, hoping maybe someone had moved it, but the forest was silent. No sign of a vehicle, no footprints, no nothing. And then, just as we were about to give up hope, we heard something. Footsteps, not far off. They were slow at first, but they were unmistakable. Someone or something was walking toward us. We froze, terrified. The footsteps were getting closer, and that's when we saw it again. Just beyond the tree line, in the shadow of the woods, the same figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes locked on us. Before any of us could react, the figure disappeared into the forest like it was never there. And suddenly, the car was back, sitting right where we had left it. I'm not sure what happened in those few moments, but I knew one thing for sure. We had just narrowly escaped something far worse than we could have imagined. We didn't speak much on the way back. We just wanted to leave. And even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever we encountered in those woods, it's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't hike anymore, and I don't think I ever will.